Hello conservationists, and welcome to Chapter 11 with Mrs. Foes. So here we're beginning the third portion of the class. First we looked at what biodiversity is, the different types, and next we looked at the threats to biodiversity, and now we're looking at how we can maintain it, as well as the human factors of how we maintain it. So Chapter 11 is protecting ecosystems, and we'll look at a few topics here. We'll look at the different categories of protected areas. We'll look at a little bit to do with reserve, selection, and design. You'll also do a case study where you read an important paper on the topic, and then we'll look a little bit at management. Okay, so there are 7 basic categories of protected areas according to the UN, the United Nations. So if you look in the US, it'll be slightly different, but these are the general types. So the different types are based on the management goals. Like, why are you doing this? Is it for science? Is it for forestry? In the size of the areas. Okay. So strictly nature reserve, a nature reserve is for science. So the example that we have here is the Green River Preserve. This is owned by the Western Kentucky Biology Department, and it's very limited in access. You can't go there unless you're part of the biology department or you're working on a topic out there. It's only for science. You can see some of the different species there, like salamanders. Okay. A really cool group, it's an NGO that works at nature preserves, is NEON. I have a friend who works here. And these are all the sites that they're at. And NEON, what they do is they collect the same type of data at all of these sites. And so they look at, temperature, water quality, they look at small mammals, amphibians, birds, and so they're collecting all this data in the same way, and it's open source, which means that you could go on and look at what they found and use that information to do a study of your own. And because they collected all the same way, you can compare all of those places very easily. Now, some methods are going to work better in one area than another, but you did it the same way, you can compare those numbers. So the next I will look at our wilderness areas, which are larger areas for wilderness protection. That's their main goal. So this would be kind of that coarse filter trying to save everything within there. So an example is Clifty Wilderness. That's within the Danube National Forest. National Forest we'll look at or something else. Okay, national parks. So here we have ecosystem protection and recreation. So these are going to be open to the public to different degrees and try to focus on education as well as conservation. So the example that we have in Kentucky is Mammoth Cave National Park. And I threw up there's a few days each year where you can get into national parks free. It's already free to go to Mammoth Cave, but for others. Next, natural monuments. So this is for an area that has a really interesting, rare, or like a culturally significant site. So an example in Kentucky is Big Bone Lick State Park. It has this big feature of fossils that they found there, mammoths. And then managed resource protected areas. So this is the sustainable use of natural resources. That's that Gifford, Pinchot, utilitarian, best use for all. So that's the resource use where we're using the resources but at a sustainable rate where we can still take the same amount the next year and the year after that, and there's still a habitat for different species. So those will be like national forests. People can still live in there and there's still log, but it will be controlled. So next we're going to look at how you select where you would put a reserve. We'll look at diversity levels, important environmental features, filling the gaps, and then how many to select. Okay, so whenever you're looking for a place to put a reserve, you want to look at where you have the most biodiversity, right? So first you'd want to do those biodiversity hotspots, where saving those areas are going to save huge amounts of biodiversity. And then you can input that into smaller scale. So like this is an island in Hawaii, and they were going to put a new reserve in. And the dark green is where they already have reserves. So what they did was they took 3 different species of birds, finches, and they radio collared them. So GIS is radio collaring. You can look at their satellite imaging. and they looked at what areas those finches were using. So if they were going to make a new reserve, they would want to put it where you have all 3 species overlapping, right? Because then you can save all of them. So maybe in this case, the best place to put the preserve would be here or here. If you put it over here, it might be a pretty area, but you're not helping out those finches. And then ecosystem and environmental surrogates. So this is that coarse filter approach. If you help save that whole ecosystem, you help save most of the species that use it, right? So to do this, though, you need a very specific ecosystem classification. Because if we just said, hey, let's preserve the forest in Kentucky, and let's pick one spot. There are several different types of forests, right? You can have ash, oak, you can have combined. What trees make that up would oftentimes be what we would use to classify forests. You could also look at those abiotic factors, right? And then you want to fill in those gaps. So look at where you already have reserves and see what you need to protect. If you protect the same thing as the other reserves, it wouldn't be as helpful as is filling the gap. So what we have here is we're looking at, in each of these, the dependent variable is the elevation of a mountain, and then the x variable, the independent, is bird species richness, mammal richness, human population, the amount of park area that they have, and the area total, looking at all land versus forest. Okay. So if you look here, we see a lot more species richness where humans like to. So we would probably want to put more reserves there. And then here's the US, and you can see where we have reserves. Those dark spots are reserves. And you'll notice that there are a few parts with more reserves. The West Coast has a lot more preserved land, and that makes sense because when people came in, colonizers, we came in, we went over, this area was the last to be claimed. This has the least amount of people privately owned land, so the public could buy it and preserve it, right? Whereas over here, lots of people already living. And then reserve design, how many to select? Okay, so this is an interesting idea based on a few topics that we'll look at. First, you have to look at your budget, so how much can you afford, and then can you afford some small spaces or can you afford to get a big one? And then this is Minnesota, and I keep going back to that because that's where I'm originally from, and they do a pretty good job. And you can see the core areas of preservation a lot over towards the north. And these dark lines are these corridor linkages. So there are corridors between all the parks for a safe way for species to move throughout, which is pretty cool. Now let's give a moment to discuss the debate here. What we're going to look at is SLOS, single, large, or several small. So this is saying, should you buy one big piece of land that's all connected, like this big circle, or should you buy smaller, unconnected areas? And so we're going to look at, you might think it's obvious to get the big one, but there can be some different ideas on that. Okay. So Jared Diamond was the first one to publish on this, and he is a professor with a great Boston accent. If you look up TED Talks, he gives a couple really good ones. His books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is great, as well as Collapse, looking at why societies collapsed in the past. And so he discussed this single, large, or several small. And so one, he said, a large reserves holds more species than a small. So right, you'd want this one. And then he says the single large is preferable to several small. And we'll look at why or why that might not be true. And then if you have several small, it's better to keep them close together than far apart. And if you have the small, they should be clustered rather than in a line. And if you can put in corridors, that's better than no corridors. And if it's more circular, you reduce the number of edge space, you got more middle. We talked about that in habitat fragmentation, where if it's narrow like this, there's no middle, so those species that don't like the edge won't be able to survive there. And that's true. So all of these reasons are why a large space would be better, or clustered and connected. Okay, so now let's look at a bit of debate there. So debate points management, it would be far easier to manage a single large space than several small spaces. And for species with a large range, it's better to have the single large space, right? But for metapopulations, so remember we looked at those with like the butterflies in the Sinai Peninsula, and how some populations there would sink and some would be sources, and so in different years they would be able to do emigration from metapopulation to population. And that was positive, right? So if you have bears, and we'll look at this later, in one area, they might decrease in their population. There might be a drought in that area. You might not have as many berries, or there might not be as many fish that year. But in the other part, they might be doing good. So they could go back and repopulate that other part. So metapopulations works better for several small. And then genetic drift. So if you remember, this is that random chance that things go wrong. So where if you step on beetles, you take out the diversity in that group, right? If you have several small, it's less likely that if there's a terrible storm that all the several small will be taken out. There's less likely if you have a fire that they're all hit by that fire, or if you have like a volcanic eruption that they're all hit. So in those two cases, several small is better. And in the first two, single large is better. Make sure you can understand this debate and the points for each side, because you'll have to answer that on a quiz. Okay. And then reserve management. So if you're making a reserve, you have to have a few ideas of how much intervention you want to do. You have to decide if you want human visitors. This is from Mount St. Helens, and I love this saying, plants grow by the inch and die by the foot. It's a good pun. And so you don't step off of the trail because those plants take a long time to recover. Do you want humans there because it's an education opportunity? Do they have to stay on your trail? Can they go anywhere they want? What are the rules for human visitors? Natural disturbances. So we've talked about fire before. Are you going to do controlled burns so that the nutrients are released to the soil? Or is there something else that you're going to do? A big one where I was at in Africa was water regimes. So especially if you have areas that have dry seasons, you have to decide whether you put out your own water or not. So where I was in South Africa, it got very dry in the summer. It was really hot. And they put out water all year round at different water holes. And that was great because the tourists that come, you can only really see elephants well when they're at water holes. You might be surprised they're big and you can kind of see them off in the distance. They look like boulders sometimes. But it's not until you have like this open space, which you find at a water hole, that you'll get to see those species well. So if it's all about tourism, then you definitely would want to supply water. But what happens to the plants around there is they start to get broken down and your species populations go up. So the elephants, water should normally be a limiting factor, but it's no longer the limiting factor. So something else is, right? Like space or plants. You have to decide what you'll do with invasive species or overabundant natives. If you don't have predators, are you going to allow hunting deer there, hunting turkeys? What levels? Are you going to do invasive species pulls? Like taking out buckthorn or kudzu? And then another really interesting question is, what is natural? Because after the Industrial Revolution, we took out a lot of forests, and we're starting to put them back. So technically we're doing better, but they looked different before. So how are you managing it? What would you consider natural? Pretty fun. Okay, that ends chapter 11. Have a great day.